Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Monster Hunter games have been around for quite some time now. It's one of those game series that managed to gather a cult-like following over the years, and Capcom never tried to reinvent the wheel. With each new Monster Hunter game, they just kept improving the base concept and added more features. For a long time, it seemed like the targeted audience for Monster Hunter games is very niche, until Monster Hunter World came out in 2018. That game managed to find its way to a more mainstream audience, and it propelled this series to new heights. It still has a very strong active player base on Steam, and I think it's going to stay that way for a long time, even though the new game in this series has been released. I have to say that I'm really glad I decided to take my time with this review, because Capcom recently released a huge content patch. So obviously I'm going to talk about all of that in the review as well. While Monster Hunter World had a slightly different design philosophy when it comes to some features, Monster Hunter Rise is more like a traditional Monster Hunter game. So is that a good or a bad thing? Well, let's find out.
Shall we go?
My history with Monster Hunter games is not that rich. Portable Third was the only Monster Hunter game that I played seriously, and I started playing World just before I got into Rise. Mainly because I wanted to be able to make some comparisons between these two games. Unsurprisingly, Rise has a lot of similarities with World, especially when it comes to the quality of life changes and the gameplay in general. The most obvious disadvantage in Rise compared to World is the performance. The Switch is running this game in 30 FPS with almost no frame drops at all, even in the most intense fight scenes. I've spent the majority of my playtime in the handheld mode, and I only occasionally hooked up my Switch on my PC monitor. Playing the game in the docked mode definitely doesn't feel that smooth to me. I don't know if this is the frame rate issue because I don't have the tools to monitor the performance, but playing in handheld mode feels a lot smoother to me. Maybe that's because it's a lot easier to notice the lower frame rate on a bigger screen. It's not unplayable for me, I'm still able to enjoy playing like this, but it's worth mentioning. I think the performance is the only bigger problem that a lot of people might have if they're coming from Monster Hunter World. Especially if you play both games on a regular basis, but it wasn't that hard for me to get used to how Monster Hunter Rise performs on the Switch after a long play session. If you are really bothered by this, you can wait for the PC port, which has been confirmed for the next year.
I really don't see how anyone could have noticed us. It was a perfect display of stealth. That's why we expect great things of you. You're always razor sharp.
Monster Hunter games were never that heavy on the story, but it seems like they tried to change this with World and Rise as well. Not necessarily to the point where the story becomes really important, but just enough to try and get you more invested in what's happening in this world. In the world of Rise, I mean, not in the world of Worlds. Yeah, anyway, to be honest, I didn't care that much about the story, but I'm still able to appreciate it because it serves as a nice change of pace. You start the game as a new hunter in Kamura village, and you're introduced to a couple of important characters like Fugen the Elder, Minoto, and her twin sister Hinoa. You will keep proving yourself useful to the village by eliminating major threats that are trying to attack the village. That's actually connected with a new gameplay feature in Rise called Rampage, but more about that later. As you progress through the ranks, you will unlock urgent quests which are pushing the story forward. That's when you get to watch some new story cutscenes. And speaking of that, one new great addition to Monster Hunter Rise is the cutscene that plays for each large monster in the game. They did a great job with this.
It will drench the snow with blood and wreak nothing but despair.
As with pretty much every Monster Hunter game, every major character has a ton of written dialogue outside of cutscenes. The story cutscenes are obviously fully voice acted, and they will keep your attention. I was able to finish the main story of the game in about 35 hours. But you can finish the main story of the game in about 15 to 20 hours, it depends on how you play the game. The thing is, the game is far from being over even after the credits start rolling. This can be a bit confusing, especially for new players of this series. The story actually continues after this by completing quests in the hub area of the game. Saying more than that would be considered as a big spoiler, so that's all you get. Even after you do all of this, the story ends on a big cliffhanger. If you've been following the news about Rise before the game got released, you probably already knew that the release version of the game won't have the full story. We're going to get a new patch near the end of May that's going to add more monsters and a new ending. Some people might be bothered by this, but honestly I don't care. I personally could play this game even if it didn't have any story at all, because I don't play it for the story, that's just a bonus for me. Even though I found the story quite generic, the characters themselves are interesting, especially the twin sisters. But yeah, don't expect to experience an amazing story, it's not what the game is all about.
I gotta say you did a great job, Hunter. Thank you.
May the heavens have mercy on you!
Monster Hunter games have one of the best third-person action-oriented gameplay, but it's also one of the most beginner-unfriendly gameplay that you might experience. And that's probably the main reason why this franchise didn't blow up a lot sooner. But look, this is something that will never change, no matter how good is the tutorial for the game. And it's actually pretty bad, but that's not the point. Almost every weapon attack that you can perform in fights locks your character in animation that can't be interrupted. This means that there is a big chance for you to get hit if you don't know the attack patterns of the monster you're fighting. And how would you know that if you never played the game before? Well, it's a learning process obviously, and it's one of those things that make the gameplay fun and engaging. The weapon you decide to use will shape your gameplay experience in a huge way, because choosing a weapon type in this game is like choosing a different class in RPGs. There are 14 different weapon types in the game. The default weapon in Monster Hunter Rise is the longsword, probably because it's one of the easier weapons for beginners. But each and every weapon type in the game has a lot of depth, even the longsword. You should definitely avoid slower weapons like greatsword if you're a beginner, because you will not have a lot of room for mistakes in fights. The positioning and timing of your hits is everything in this game, especially with slower weapons. You have to dedicate yourself to animations that can be cancelled, and some people think that this is what makes the gameplay clunky. Well, those people are wrong. Now look, the gameplay in Monster Hunter Rise can be described in a lot of ways, but clunky is definitely not one of them. The controls are tight and precise, the animations are smooth as butter, hitboxes are pretty good except the air hitboxes that are dog shit, and a large majority of monster attacks are well telegraphed. So no, the gameplay in Rise is far from being clunky, but it has a steep learning curve, that's for sure. I've spent more than 100 hours playing with only one weapon, and that's the greatsword. So my personal experience with the game so far is entirely from the perspective of a greatsword user. Even though I'm not actually a total beginner when it comes to Monster Hunter games, I have to admit that I had a lot of problems in the beginning. And by problems, I mean I sucked with this weapon so bad. But after about 30 hours with the game, I really got comfortable with this weapon type. That's because I have learned how monsters behave, and after you pass that point, you can start experimenting with basically all weapon types in the game if you want to. But until then, I recommend trying out all weapon types in the game in the training area, and then choose one that suits you the best and stick with it. One brand new feature in Rise that changes the way you play the game with all weapons is wirebugs. By default, you get 2 of these wirebugs that you can use as mobility or attack skills. Each weapon type has different wirebug attacks, but what's a lot more important in my opinion is the mobility. Like I said before, I started playing World not so long ago, and when Rise came out, I played both games in my spare time. And whenever I jumped from Rise to World, I immediately felt the lack of mobility, especially as a greatsword user. Wirebugs in Rise allow you to quickly reposition yourself, which is really useful after you make some dumb mistakes. But of course, there are a ton of different situations where you can effectively use wirebug skills. If by some chance you couldn't get into previous Monster Hunter games because you had problems with the lack of mobility in fights, you will absolutely love the warbugs in Rise. But I have to admit that Capcom took a big risk with this. Monster Hunter games were always known for slow and methodical gameplay. Jumping around like a Spider-Man all the time doesn't exactly fit that description. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the moveset which Warbucks provides, but I'm kinda worried about the direction of future Monster Hunter games. I just hope it won't turn into a crazy fast-paced anime RPG, that's all. The last thing related to Warbucks that I have to mention is the ability to mount monsters in fights. Each time you use Warbug attacks, you do special damage, which allows you to mount and control monsters. It's a bit gimmicky mechanic that allows you to do some cheap damage to monsters, but it's actually kinda cool. I think it should be a bit harder to do, because being able to quickly mount these epic monsters kinda softens the danger you should feel when fighting them. That's not a huge deal, it's just a little nitpick.
Wonderful work, my friend. That'll do.
Speaking of new features, let's talk about Rampage mode for a second. Rampage is basically a tower defense mode, and like I said before, it's connected to the main story of the game. You have to stop the monsters from breaking the main gate of the village by setting up turrets and other defense utilities. While you can play it in the single player mode, it's a lot more interesting and manageable with at least one more hunter in online modes. Not to say that this gameplay mode is hard, even if you play it alone it's actually quite easy when you learn how everything works. But in classical Monster Hunter manner, it's kinda poorly explained. The thing is, I don't like the Rampage modes. I don't exactly hate it, but I haven't done a Rampage in the last 20 hours of my gameplay time or something close to that, which is a pretty good sign of me not liking it. Maybe this is because I don't enjoy tower defense games in general, but I also have one specific problem with this mode in Rise. And it's the same argument I already made about Warbucks as well. The same monsters you're fighting through the regular hunts are in the Rampage mode as well, but there is almost no sense of danger at all. Except the Apex monsters, which are really cool actually, and we just recently got the option to hunt some of them through the regular hunts as well. But yeah, all of the other monsters in the Rampage are basically just pests. The highlight of this gameplay mode is how crazy it can actually get, especially with a couple of more hunters. But even if you don't particularly enjoy playing it, like myself, you'll have to play it regardless. Not just because it's essential for a couple of main story quests, but you will need some specific crafting materials, which you can only get in the Rampage. I know that Capcom is trying to add interesting and new features to the game, but Tower Defense mode was probably the last thing on my wishlist, even though the premise of this mode kinda makes sense from the story perspective. When it comes to the core gameplay loop of Rise, it's essentially the same thing like it always was, with a couple of changes here and there. You hunt monsters and craft new gear to hunt bigger monsters. You start in the low rank and you progress all the way to the high rank. The new patch has unlocked the hunter rank, which means that now it basically scales indefinitely. You will need to increase your hunter rank in order to unlock new monsters which are added in the new patch. Crafting is a big deal in the game and it has a lot of depth. There are a ton of different armor sets and weapons that you can craft and experiment with different builds. The way you make different builds in the game is by trying to get specific skills that go well with your weapon or the playstyle in general. So you can combine armor pieces from different sets to get desirable skills. But you can also get the skills from decorations and talismans. Decorations are like gems that you can slot in your armor, and you can get them by crafting, just like every other armor piece. Talismans are a big deal in the game, and the system which the game is using for getting them is heavy on the RNG. It's actually really satisfying and exciting to get them, probably because they work really similar to loot boxes, so they have that dopamine effect. Don't worry though, you don't have to pay real money for talismans, but you will need to invest crafting materials that you get from the hunts. A good talisman can basically shape your entire builds. The only problem I have with the skills in this game is how vague the description on some of them is, but it's not a big deal. The new patch brought us a transmog system as well, and unsurprisingly, this system also requires specific materials. So it's another gameplay feature that requires grinding. The thing is, if you really hate grinding, I don't think any of the Monster Hunter games are for you. The gameplay in Monster Hunter Rise will keep you really busy all the time. Speaking of that, before we got a new patch, some people thought that there is not a lot of things to do in the endgame. I can't really comment on that because I got into endgame right after the patch. There is a pretty decent amount of things to do in the endgame in the current version of the game, and it will only get better in the future. We currently have 43 monsters in the game, which is a pretty decent number to keep you busy. While I don't want to talk about individual encounters in order to avoid spoilers, I have to mention the flagship monster of Rise. Magnemalo is an amazing monster and it's a big turning point in your progression paths. It's a pretty big difficulty spike, almost to the point where it feels a bit unfair. It's a lot easier if you're playing with a couple of more hunters, but I recommend trying to hunt every monster alone at first. And that's exactly what I did. Hunting in multiplayer can go in both ways actually. It can be a lot easier if the hunters are experienced, or a lot harder if they're not. I have to mention that Monster Hunter games have one of the best online communities, so you won't have problems to find friendly hunters to play with. The last couple of things I want to talk about related to gameplay are buddies and the map design of Rise. Buddies are your followers that you can recruit in the game. You have Palicos and Palamutes. Palamutes are a brand new feature in Rise and you can use them as mounts. I find this kinda ironic because maps in Rise are significantly smaller compared to maps in World, and Monster Hunter World didn't have any mounts. Your buddies have different classes and skills, so they can help you in hunts in various ways. There is a special place in Hub for your buddies where you can do a couple of activities between hunts, which can bring you some free items. All of your buddies are customizable as well, which is nice. But what's really impressive to me when it comes to buddies is their AI. The AI in the game is impressive in general, and buddies are definitely not an exception. It's always fun to watch when they pull off some interesting tricks in fights. Don't expect to see some crazy damage numbers from them, but they can give you some really useful buffs, and most of their offensive skills are pretty good. When it comes to the map design in Rise, they are a lot smaller compared to the map design in Worlds, but they make this up with a crazy amount of verticality, which makes the exploration a lot more interesting, especially because of the wire bugs. You can discover some secret areas on every map and find some unique items. The thing I don't really like is how easy it is to find monsters on the map. Capcom streamlined some recognizable features of the series, like having to mark monsters so you can see them on the map, and a couple of more things. And because of this, every hunt in Rise is a mechanical process. You can straight away see the location of all monsters and just rush to fight them, which is not really exciting like actually trying to find monsters like in Worlds. But I think this is highly subjective, some people might prefer this approach. The sound design in Monster Hunter games was always really good, and Rise is not an exception. All monsters have easily recognizable sounds, and weapon sound effects are great. In my particular case with the Greatsword, I find it a lot easier to time my charge attacks because of the better sound and visual effects compared to those in Worlds. The sound effect for the Greatsword was a bit muffled in Worlds, and the visual effect was not that great either. Rise has a really decent soundtrack as well, although it's not something that I personally prefer. I like it, but I don't exactly love it. And last but not least, the English voice acting is pretty damn good. There are just a handful of important characters in the game, so it would really suck if the voice acting was bad. Fortunately, that's not the case.
Attack the village in a frenzied rage. Nobody knows why this happens, but it came close to wiping out our village last time.
Monster Hunter Rise is a great sequel. 100 hours in this game is basically nothing. I'm going to continue playing for God knows how long. If you don't like older Monster Hunter games, Rise will not change your minds. But if you're looking to get into this series, Rise is probably the best game to start with. Even though I'm slightly worried about the direction of this series, all of the new features in Rise are fun and refreshing. Well, almost all features. If it's not obvious already, I highly recommend getting this game if you want a Switch. It's definitely a system seller if you ask me. And that will be all for this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more RPG contents. If you want to support the channel in the long run, consider becoming a Patreon or a YouTube member. You can get your name on the end credits, as well as some other perks like early access to videos, Discord roles, my plans for future content, etc, etc. That will be all, and I'll see you in the next one.